Granicus proved Alexander could survive. In 333 BCE, Persia answered with something far more dangerous, the King of Kings himself. For the first time, Darius III would command the battle in person, certain that one fight would end the war. Unlike Granicus, this battlefield offered no space. Mountains and sea would compress both armies into a narrow killing ground. At Issus, two kings would finally face each other, one commanding an empire, the other commanding momentum. Issus was the opposite of Gaugamela. Here, numbers could not spread out or surround. Mountains rose on one side, the sea closed the other. The battlefield narrowed into a corridor where mass became a liability instead of an advantage. Darius had brought the full weight of the Persian Empire, expecting to overwhelm Alexander. Instead, he trapped his own army in terrain that erased its greatest strength. Darius believed this was the moment Persia would restore order. He commanded overwhelming numbers and expected Alexander to retreat once confronted by the king himself. Persian nobles gathered around him, confident that imperial presence alone would decide the battle. This was meant to be a demonstration of authority, not a contest. Alexander immediately understood the gift Issus offered him. The narrow ground meant the Persian army could not deploy fully. Cavalry could not envelop. Infantry could not maneuver freely. For the first time, Alexander faced the Persian king on terrain that favored discipline over numbers. The battle would be decided by nerve and timing. Persian infantry packed tightly into the center, cavalry squeezed against terrain that limited movement. The Macedonian phalanx formed opposite them, compact and controlled. Both armies understood that retreat would be difficult once fighting began. Issus was not a battlefield where mistakes could be corrected. This battle was more than military. It was psychological. If Alexander broke before the king, his victories would be reinterpreted as luck. If Darius fled again, Persian authority would suffer a wound it might never heal. Both men understood this, even before the first spear was raised. As the lines moved forward, the space between mountain and sea filled with noise and motion. There was no room for delay, no room for wide maneuvers. Whatever happened next would unfold quickly and decisively. As the armies advanced, the terrain immediately shaped the fight. The narrow strip of land between mountain and sea forced both sides inward, compressing formations until movement became difficult. Persian numbers could not spread or envelop. Units collided head-on, packed tightly, struggling for space as much as for advantage. What had been an imperial host now fought as a crowded mass, while the Macedonians advanced exactly as trained, tight, controlled, and deliberate. Issus was already stripping Persia of its greatest strength. Darius positioned himself at the center of the Persian line, surrounded by guards, nobles, and elite infantry. His presence was meant to stabilize the army and project absolute authority. Persian infantry pressed forward in dense ranks, attempting to crush the Macedonian phalanx through sheer weight. But the narrow terrain worked against them. Orders became difficult to relay, formations compressed, and units began to lose alignment. What should have been a display of imperial control slowly turned into a struggle to maintain cohesion under pressure. The Macedonian phalanx absorbed the Persian advance without breaking formation. Shields remained locked. Sarissas held steady as the line advanced step by step. The confined battlefield prevented Persian cavalry from maneuvering freely, forcing infantry into a direct contest of discipline. Where the Persian center pushed forward unevenly, the Macedonian line moved as a single body. The battle slowed into brutal close combat, and control, not numbers, began to decide the outcome. As infantry clashed in the center, Alexander did not remain fixed behind the line. He studied the battlefield continuously, watching how pressure developed and where command weakened. Alexander was not interested in winning through attrition. He understood that Persian power rested on authority, not endurance. Somewhere ahead stood the King of Kings. If that authority collapsed, the battle would end instantly. Alexander prepared to act on that understanding. Alexander gathered the companion cavalry on the right flank, pressing them into a tight formation suited to the narrow ground. This was not a wide-sweeping maneuver, but a focused thrust. The terrain limited speed, yet it also limited resistance. Every rider knew the objective was not to scatter Persian forces, but to strike where command was concentrated. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and timed to the growing strain in the Persian center. When the companion cavalry advanced, The clash near the Persian center was immediate and violent. Persian guards rushed forward to intercept, turning the area around Darius into chaos. Horses collided, weapons flashed, and dust reduced visibility to moments and instinct. Control narrowed to individual actions, but momentum favored the attackers. Alexander pressed forward relentlessly, closing distance as resistance struggled to reorganize under pressure. As fighting intensified near the royal position, the situation around Darius deteriorated rapidly. Guards fell, formations blurred, and the confidence that had defined Persian deployment vanished. The danger was no longer theoretical. Alexander's presence was felt directly, not through reports or distant movement. The memory of earlier defeat resurfaced, not as panic, but as recognition that authority itself was being threatened once again. At Issus, the decisive moment came quickly. Faced with the collapse forming around him, Darius turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. The decision was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of soldiers saw their king abandon the field. In that single act, Persian command disintegrated. Orders ceased, confidence evaporated, and resistance lost its purpose. The battle was decided not by slaughter, but by the sudden absence of authority. With the king gone, the Persian line unraveled. Units disengaged without coordination, retreating through narrow ground that magnified confusion. What had been a massive army moments earlier dissolved into fragments of fleeing men. The collapse spread faster than any command could counter. Persia was not defeated through destruction alone, but through the psychological shock of leadership failure in full view of its army. Alexander immediately pressed the pursuit, understanding the opportunity before him. Capturing Darius could end the war entirely. Macedonian cavalry surged forward, driving fleeing units ahead of them. But exhaustion, terrain, and fading light slowed the chase. The Persian king escaped, but only barely. The empire survived the day, but its image of invincibility did not. Issus was a hard-fought victory. The narrow battlefield had forced brutal, sustained combat, leaving significant casualties on both sides. Macedonian losses were real, and the army felt the cost of close fighting. Yet strategically, the outcome was overwhelming. Persia had committed its king and failed. The psychological balance of the war shifted permanently in Alexander's favor. In his flight, Darius left behind his family, treasury, and personal possessions. Alexander treated the captives with restraint and respect, understanding the political weight of mercy. This was not compassion alone, it was calculation. By presenting himself as a legitimate ruler rather than a destroyer, Alexander strengthened his claim to authority over the lands he conquered. News of Issus spread rapidly across Asia. Cities reconsidered resistance. Satraps hesitated. Allies wavered. The image of the King of Kings fleeing for the second time could not be ignored. Persian authority bled away, not through defeat alone, but through disbelief. The war was no longer about whether Alexander could be stopped, but when the empire would finally give way. Issus confirmed what Granicus had only suggested. Alexander had now defeated Persia twice and driven its king from the battlefield in person. The empire still possessed land, armies, and wealth, but its confidence was shattered. From this moment forward, the war would unfold on Alexander's terms. Persia would fight on, but belief had already begun to collapse. Granicus proved Alexander could survive in Asia, but survival was never the real test. In 333 BCE, the Persian Empire answered not with satraps, not with generals, but with its king. For the first time, Darius III, ruler of the largest empire on earth, would take the field in person. He believed one battle would erase the invasion forever. What followed was not the open plains of Granicus, it was a trap of geography. At Issus, mountains pressed in from one side, the sea from the other. There was no room to maneuver, no space to retreat. Two armies were forced into a narrow corridor where numbers became a weakness and discipline became everything. Here, Alexander the Great would face the King of Kings directly, not across messages, not across years, but across a battlefield where one moment of hesitation would decide the fate of an empire. This was not a battle of size, it was a battle of nerve, of command. Who broke first when escape vanished? And when the fighting ended, the ancient world would never see Persian power the same way again. So here's the question for you. If you were standing in Alexander's place, outnumbered, trapped between mountain and sea, would you attack the king, or wait and risk being crushed? This story continues in Episode 3. Subscribe to Blackstone Battlecraft to follow the conquest step by step, because this war was decided not by fate, but by decisions made in moments like this.